homeschooler? Please raise your hand. Yeah, that's what I figured. Me too. The general assumption seems to be that homeschooled kids will emerge into society at 18 like confused woodland creatures. But according to the National Home Education Research Institute, this is untrue. Common stereotypes about homeschoolers, including lower academic achievements or the inability to adjust to large group settings, are not based in fact. Something that is, however, based in fact is that the transition from homeschool to high school is the biggest adjustment for some homeschoolers. For me, it introduced me to a monumental change in my daily schedule, forced me to stick to one curriculum and teaching style, and changed my perspective on learning altogether. When I was 2, my mom decided to start teaching me how to read. Within 6 months, I was reading at a first grade level, and my mom realized that the public education system would do nothing good for me. I spent the next 12 years being homeschooled. I participated in Classical Conversations, which is a Christian-based homeschool program that meets for a few hours once a week each morning. As the pandemic neared its end, my parents realized they wanted me to experience a little of what high school had to offer. So we moved from South Florida to northern Vermont, and I began what I like to call the most challenging years of my life. As a student who made the transition from an at-home education style to group-setting schooling, I understand the social, academic, and even mental pressures that this experience requires of you better than pretty much anyone else. Peer-reviewed study by Bubb et al. 2020 defines whole group or group-setting education as, quote, the standard model of instruction, wherein the educator leads the class and the group learns as a collective. This is the traditional, teacher-centric way of educating, end quote. This definition includes online education, schools such as the Waldorf schools, and all private, public, and preparatory schools. With this definition fitting a majority of students globally, the National Home Education Research Institute reports that 6.7% of 2024 students in America were homeschooled. With this statistic in mind, I decided to take a look at St. Johnsbury Academy's statistic, and I discovered that 4.4% of SJA students are homeschooled, or were homeschooled before attending here. So with 50 students at the Academy being homeschooled, why aren't there more supports for students here at the Academy? Sure, we have the advisor program, the learning center, the special services department, conference period, but these are all just a few stirrups for all students. These initial questions led me to my 2 research questions. Firstly, have students who made the switch to St. Johnsbury Academy felt successful in this environment, as opposed to homeschooled ones? Secondly, how can SJAs aid students in this transition? Previous studies, such as those by Del Bono et al. Or Harmy and Moss, focused on the impact that COVID had on students' transition to high school, specifically those forced into an at-home schooling education. These 2 studies stress the importance of having mental health professionals, added support in the classroom for both students and teachers, and overall creating a more comfortable environment for all involved in the learning process during those trying times, and now even. Nope, sorry. Lee et al. 2021 study surveyed homeschooled students who switched to high school while these supports were still in place, and compared their experiences to students who lacked these supports. This study found that homeschooled students who had the aforementioned supports were far more successful with their group setting education than those who did not have the supports. Early on in my research, I focused on my attention to the first of the 2 research questions. Using purposive sampling, I conducted semi-structured interviews with members of the student body, their families, and teachers here at SJA. In order to maintain security of the private information while still keeping track of where that information came from, I assigned each interviewee a letter and a number. For example, the first teacher that I interviewed is referred to as T1 when I'm citing their interview. This methodology, as well as the framework of my outcome, is based on peer-reviewed studies by Lee et al., Bubb et al., and Schachter et al. Bubb et al. Gathered information for their study of homeschooled student success rates in public school by using purposive sampling and a combination of surveys and semi-structured interviews. I opted I opted to place informational signage around campus and hold a short interview with each individual who responded to me. And if they fit the criteria I was seeking, I scheduled more in-depth interview to be held at a later date. Additionally, I extended invitations to members of faculty whom I believed would be of help to me if interviewed. These interviews helped me gain a better understanding of the educational environment and how educational environment I am in now and how it differed from the one I experienced growing up. Additionally, it led me to my second research question. How can SJA aid students transition between education styles? With the second question in mind, I circled back to the existing supports I had identified earlier and how they might benefit this niche of students. The most beneficial and public group by far that I identified is the Learning Center. It is accessible to all students throughout the day and offers both a quiet study space as well as educators to assist students in their schoolwork. Studies show that specialized academic support programs significantly improve student success, especially for students transitioning from non-traditional educational models. Schachter et al. 2021. However, while resources like the Learning Center are excellent and include educators that are specific to fields such as math or English, they lack specialization in assisting specifically homeschooled students. After combining this deduction with the information my interviews provided me with, I decided I wanted to found a student-led program that would combine the social and academic aspects of St. Johnsbury Academy in a relaxed setting to help students like myself transition between education styles. I drafted up a proposed program to present to my interviewees. I asked each of them the same question. If a program aimed to help with the transition from homeschool to group setting schooling had existed, would you have utilized it? Why or why not? I changed the wording of this question slightly when asked to teachers and parents, but the question still aimed to ask whether or not the interviewee thought a program like this would be useful to them or their student. 100% of interviewees responded positively to this question. They all agreed that a program that benefits homeschooled students at the Academy could boost confidence both academically and socially, and therefore create a healthier learning environment for all students. I had a bit more trouble drafting up questions to ask educators. As someone who grew up with little understanding of the public education system, I knew I needed to ask some inaugural questions. A lot of the questions I asked involved comparing and contrasting how students who have just begun working in group setting schooling versus how those who have been participating in it their whole lives learn in the classroom. Gathering this information from the educators was critical, as it gave me insight into whether the challenges homeschooled students face are isolated incidents or part of the broader trends that the Academy could address systematically. Additionally, I was able to ask educators themselves if they noticed whether or not homeschooled students struggled more or less as opposed to their group setting educated peers. The Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy Homeschool Hub 2023 reports that only about 9% of parents who homeschool their children are not confident in their students succeeding in college. And comparatively, 70% of parents choose to send their child to attend high school and graduate from there. Peer-reviewed study by B.D. Ray, 2013, conducted a controlled study on students during both their time in homeschool and in high school. These students were assessed using their GPA scores and their SAT scores. Some were provided with a group similar to the one I plan on implementing. Ray reports that the homeschooled students who participated in the group during their high school career had a higher success rate in college and even in the workforce following their education. I chose to include this study specifically due to its in-depth glance of the successes of students both during and after their participation in both education styles, as well as the extra stirrups that this study provided them with. With studies proving the effectiveness of similar programs, I began the preparations to create one of my own. This program would be made by homeschooled students for homeschooled students and be specifically tailored to St. Johnsbury Academy. It would create a space for students to share tactics to understand the different teaching styles the Academy has to offer, while also offering a social space for these students to interact in. I plan to base the leadership of this program to mimic a council-like setting, as well as using Schachter et al.'s program to guide me through the creation of the program. When I proposed this idea to the panel at my research process review, one comment above all stood out to me. It was suggested during my research process review that on orientation day, I create a separate orientation specifically for homeschooled students. After a short interview with Ms. Huntington, Dean of Community, she explained that this was her idea, and we began brainstorming how to implement it. We decided that a short, separate orientation for homeschooled students on either or both orientation days at the beginning of both semesters would be the best course of action. My goals for this meeting would be to show students that there are other students with similar educational backgrounds and recognize that there are others at the academy already who experience the same or similar pre-high school education. Introduce to them that there's a space for these students to congregate in a less academic-centered setting than the Learning Center, and even have upperclassmen who are from same or similar backgrounds to answer any questions these students may have. I, of course, have to recognize that there are some setbacks and limitations to my project. Firstly, all stops could be pulled if I get denied approval to even have a group meet, where while it is still possible, it seems rather unlikely at this point in my project. Then, of course, I have to recognize that it could be difficult to find a teacher who doesn't have prior commitments to help run this group, especially finding a space and the free time. Establishing a strong foundational council to continue meetings after my tenure at the academy is what I believe to be the most pressing issue at hand. So, of course, with a room of students here listening to me, I ask that anyone interested, please come see me after my capstone. Lastly, while not the biggest issue, finding time that a majority of participants are still available to hold meetings could become a problem. This capstone project was originally an AP Research one, but due to some family illness, I had to stay in Florida a few extra weeks into the first semester. With the guidance of my counselor, teachers, and family, we decided that academically, it was smartest to transfer to a regular capstone class. I quickly pivoted my focus from homeschoolers in America to homeschoolers at SJA. This allowed me to create a deeper connection and love for my project, as well as gain understanding of what my homeschooled peers here at SJA have experienced. A few of my peers asked me if I chose to do this project to educate those who have bullied me for being homeschooled over the past 4 years, and this is my answer to that. If the way a student was educated is enough to bully them over, then those people need to take some self-reflection. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you ever just need to talk. I'm always open to that. I've often compared myself to my peers, and through this comparison, I recognize the magnitude of what I've accomplished. High school shouldn't define who you are by any means. Rather, inspire who you will be in the coming years. I hope that my capstone project, even though the outcome is still being workshopped, will aid students who had the same anxiety I did and help them through their 4 years here. These are my sources, and I appreciate your time, presence, and attention during my presentation. Are there any questions?
Hi, so my question is, how did you measure student success?
I planned to measure student success initially when it was my AP Research project by asking students themselves whether they felt successful academically, socially, and emotionally, and whether or not they thought that their schooling experience benefited them or challenged them in ways that they needed to work around that a little bit more. So it was purely based off of the students themselves. I considered using a rubric while we were interviewing, I asked them specific questions, but I didn't want to hold anybody to a standard because the way I measure success could be completely different from the way you measure yourself being successful, so I figured it's up to everybody's own interpretation. Thank you.
What are the major struggles for a student who transformed?
What was that?
What are the major struggles for a student who moved from homeschool to STJ, especially, and then how the struggle presented in the school? Have various interviews or schools.
Okay, so I can't speak for everybody. I can speak for myself. One of the biggest struggles for me was adjusting to deadlines for schoolwork, because what my mom would do is she'd set up the curriculum and she'd be like, you have an essay due in 3 days. And I could do the essay in that one day and spend my entire 2 hours that I spent in the school setting working on that, or I could wait 3 days and get it done then. So I can't really speak for everybody, but through my interviews, what I noticed is deadlines were hard. Advisories were a little bit challenging for some homeschooled students, especially because when you're homeschooled, your time when you're studying, at least for me, was you're working on schoolwork and then you go off and do something else, like a social activity. Schooling and the social life weren't something that were really combined, and that seemed to be a major theme. Thank you.
Hi. If you had additional time or resources, what would you further in your research?
I love this question. So I really, really wanted to research where homeschooled kids, whether or not they succeeded in college. And I would like to get a control group of students who are homeschooled all the way through until college, students who are homeschooled for a little bit and then transferred to high school, and students who were just homeschooled all the way through and participated in online college, just to gauge the success. Homeschooling wasn't made legal in the United States until 1974, even though if you look back to westward expansion, that's the only education that most people had then, which is really interesting since homeschooling is some of the foundations of American education. Like, why was it not legal until 1974? So now I want to look at how did these different education styles affect students' lives for the rest of them. Thank you.
With your personal experience on this topic, how do you think that helped or maybe even affected your research for this project?
So I would say that being a homeschooler and looking into this actually challenged a lot of the information that I was gaining. I looked at it with sort of, oh, I know everything about what I'm going into researching this homeschool-wise. And I knew I had a lot to learn on the public education side, but there are so many different ways that somebody can be homeschooled that I had a lot to learn there. So I really had to open my perspective of homeschooling in order to even do this project. Thank you.
Did you at any point take neurodivergency with homeschooling into consideration with the transition?
Yes, I did. So I'm an autistic individual. I was also diagnosed with ADHD. This happened before I was even in high school, and likely if I'd been in the public education system, I would have been diagnosed a little earlier. Originally, because it was an AP research project, I did want to focus specifically on neurodivergent homeschoolers and whether or not being neurodivergent helped or hindered them when they switched to high school, or if they switched to high school. But because AP research requires you to find a gap in your research, there was so much research already done on that topic that it was just not feasible for me to even attempt to do that. Thank you.
What would you say was the best homeschool learning style for you and maybe others in research, and how would you compare that to how you learned in high school in a classroom?
I love this question. So for me, my favorite way to learn was when we'd go on road trips. My dad was lucky enough to work 24 hours on shift and 48 off as a firefighter in Florida, and even take up to 2 weeks off at a time. So the most vivid thing that I can remember is when we went and lived like we were in colonial Williamsburg for 2 weeks. I learned so much, and then we went to Monticello, and I learned how Thomas Jefferson installed the clock. And it shows the days of the week, and you can only see Saturday on the day that it is Saturday. That's how the pendulum works. And that was my favorite, was traveling around and learning from individuals who specialized in their fields, and having them educate me personally rather than learning from a textbook or watching videos or what have you. Through my interview process, I didn't get a chance to ask students what their favorite education style was before they transferred to high school, just because I didn't want to focus too much on how did homeschooling affect your learning now. I want to know how is high school affecting your learning. So switching to sitting in a chair for pretty much 8 hours out of a day was definitely one of the biggest themes that came up that is the hardest for homeschooled students to adjust to.
What is the biggest adjustment that ought to be made to Schachter's group method when implementing it at SJA?
So Schachter Schachter et al. Based their study out of Missouri and the Midwest, specifically Missouri and Michigan. So they were really big schools with far less international diversity than the academy has. And I want to make sure that the program that I'm implementing is open to all students, not just homeschooled students, simply because Scakters was open to only homeschooled students, and they had such a small sample rate, and it was really hard to gauge their success, and it was less of a social group and more academically centered. So I want to add more of a social aspect to mine.
Did you take people who were maybe like pulled out of school during COVID or homeschooled during the pandemic into consideration when you were looking into this?
Yes, yes I did. When I looked up the initial definition of homeschooling, it is anyone who is educated at home by a parent or a single online educator that is not in a group setting. So while I did interview many students who were pulled out of school because of COVID, I made sure to focus my attention on not that, because that was something that every student was forced into before high school, and that could skew the sample a lot. And that's why I mentioned the preliminary interviews, because there were some students who referred to themselves as homeschooled students when they weren't exactly, they were just educated at home during the pandemic, and that's the purpose of the preliminary interviews. Thank you.